Okay, U.S. History, Chapter 12, the Great Depression. How did the Great Depression happen, and how did Americans respond to it? So, when we look at the causes of the Great Depression, how did the prosperity of the 1920s give way? When we go through the section, discuss weaknesses in the economy of the 1920s, how the stock market crash contributed to the coming of the Great Depression, describe how the Depression spread overseas, which is known as financial contagion, explain the difference between a recession and a depression, and then outline the primary causes of the Great Depression. So when we look at prosperity hiding troubles, we've got a decade of Republican presidents, so 1920 through 1932. There's a lot of confidence. The prosperity in the United States, especially once we get out of the post-war transition period. So beginning probably 1922, 1923, things are really starting to look up. And the other thing is with this, people are getting more and more confident that even better days are ahead. And that optimism that begins with Harding, continues through Coolidge, is going to sweep Hoover easily into victory. And when we look at Hoover and how he responds to things, or what he really believes in, he really believes in voluntary cooperation, that given the opportunity. So you got to keep in mind Hoover's from Iowa, and so his experience was when things got tough, neighbors helped each other out, and they voluntarily cooperated and got along and did what needed to be done to make sure that everyone survived to the best of their ability. And that's really going to shape his response to the Great Depression a little bit later on. At the end of the last chapter, or at least several times through the last chapter, I kind of stress the fact that there are these underlying problems that aren't really very apparent. And some of those are in the agricultural section. So if you look at the prices for crops from 1912 to 1913, and then you compare them to the prices 20 years later, you can begin to see how this general trend, especially after World War I, when the demand for crops drops and the amount of production stays high, this is going to lead to these declining prices, and it's going to make it really tough on American farmers. And this is 21% of the workforce. And we've got the coal miners, we've got textile industries, we got a few other industries that are going to be pretty much in the same boat as farmers. And the problem that you're going to run into is we're going to get this big discrepancy between the top 1% and the bottom 42%. And that is a real issue because the bottom 42%, nearly half of Americans, aren't able to buy anything but bare necessities. That's going to lead to underconsumption. Fewer and fewer people are going to buy stuff, and that's going to make it hard. The other thing is when we look at the credit, the easy credit, that's hiding problems too, because Americans at that time were living beyond their means. And all you need is some kind of an economic crisis, and all of that easy credit's going to come crashing down on Americans. When you look at this chart, 1956, the average savings per year for Americans was $4,217. Average debt was $23,134. If you go to the 1920s, you can see this kind of peak period just before the 1930s. But what really gets interesting is when we go to 2010 and we look at the amount of savings Americans have is actually smaller than when back in 1950, and the amount of debt that they're carrying is quite a bit higher. Stock market crashes. Part of the reason for the stock market crash is, again, all of these experts are telling Americans that they can be rich, they can be wealthy. All you have to do is get into the stock market, buy low, sell high. And this is going to lead to most people who are involved in the stock market being speculators. The stock market is going to work pretty well As long as the vast majority of people who are investing in the stock market are investing in the long term economic growth of the United States. When you get into trouble is when the vast majority of people who are investing are trying to buy stock at a low price, sell it at a high price, because you get too much fluctuation. Prices go up and up and up as people buy it, and then when they start selling and everybody starts selling, they drop. And then we're going to get this up and down, up and down, up and down. October 29th, 1929 is when the stock market crashes. It had run into problems 5 or 6 days earlier than that, but the leading bankers had bailed the stock market out. By October 29th, 1929, JP Morgan and some of those big wigs are no longer interested in bailing out the stock market, and it crashes. 16 million shares are sold, and it loses an estimated $15 billion of wealth that just disappears, and it doesn't come back. Now, this does not start the Great Depression. Um, there is some correlation, but not causation. It's going to mark the beginning of the Great Depression because after the stock market crash, it's hard for Americans to claw their way out of kind of something that had been coming for an awful long time. And so you can see what this speculation does in 1924 as Americans start to invest in the stock market, how much it increases over that period of time, and then when it bottoms out here. The other problem we run into is banks collapsing. As the stock market crashes, people begin to withdraw their money from banks. And one of the problems that you ran into is banks are just like anything else. They're a business. They use your money to make money. Lots of banks had invested in the stock market. So when the stock market crashes, they lost people's savings. When we look at the impact that this has on Iowa, Iowa led the nation in bank failures. In 1925, Iowa had 14,000 banks. In 1933, there were 802 banks left, with 80 plus as 111 banks, which means that they could only take deposits. They could not do any of the other things that normal banks did. The other problem you run into then is businesses are going to close and unemployment rises. So when we look at the Great Depression that we recently went through, unemployment reaches a high of 10% in June of 2009. When you look at the Great Depression in 1933, we hit an all-time high of 25% unemployment. The other thing to keep in mind is there are some places that are far worse than others. So, for example, in Indiana, I think it was Muncie, Indiana, maybe. Muncie, Indiana was a one factory town, and when that factory closed, they had closer to 80-90% unemployment. The other thing that's going to add to this is tariffs. As American businesses and as the business starts to dry up, what they want to do is they want to protect American businesses. So they start to place very high tariffs on things being imported from other countries. In retaliation, other countries place really high tariffs on American made goods. And the net effect is that everybody is selling less, and that's going to deepen the Great Depression. The other thing it does is once we start to place these tariffs, the depression goes global. And American loans that we have been sending overseas, so for example, the Dawes Plan, when the Great Depression hits, we can no longer afford to continue to give those loans. We dry that up. Along with that, the world's money supply shrinks, which means the rest of the world has less money to buy American-made goods or to buy their own goods, and this is just going to deepen the Great Depression. So if we look at the causes, historians disagree as to which cause is maybe the most important cause and the exact cause, but in general, most historians and scholars will say that the monetary policy, the way the government reacts, is a part of it. High tariffs, war debts, the stock market crash, financial panic, the farm crisis, overproduction in both industry and agriculture. If we look at the 1928 presidential election, I don't know necessarily that that was a cause, just because it's hard to know how another person would have reacted, and it's hard to know if they could have done anything different. And then this unequal distribution of wealth is a real problem. So again, there's no clear consensus here. Keynesian economics, which you'll hear from time to time today, what Keynes said is the contraction of the money supply, the crash and the run on the banks is what really was the key cause. And it was a lack of government action and regulation. And so because the government wasn't regulating the stock market, it caused all this wild speculation. And according to Keynes, what should have happened is instead of restricting the money supply, what the US government should have done is what's known priming the pump. They should have thrown money into circulation, and then that would have gotten the flow of money going again. And so when you look at the stimulus with John Green, if you happen to watch this, talks about what the stimulus package was with President Obama. They talked about the three T's: timing, targeted, timely, targeted, and temporary. But when you look at why the United States government spent so much money in 2007, 2008, 2009 for this recession, it was in the hopes of avoiding another Great Depression.